So, if you're getting started with Next.js and you're struggling to learn all the fundamentals and the prior stuff that you have already actually learned with something like the Query React application or the CSR regular classic React, well, in this particular video, we will go through the steps into like choosing or particularly moving from a React application aspect of all the fundamentals that React provides, the CSR and rendering and fetching data and doing props and all that sort of stuff, into moving into how Next.js works and using server-side rendering plus static site generation. So we'll be going through two applications that are theoretically the same thing, but they are built on different stuff. One is built on the actual Next.js application, and the other one is built on the classic CSR application or the React application using the Query React app. So as you can see here, they are pretty identical, and this one's gonna like use some APIs. To access the API, it's gonna fetch the data, it's gonna allow you to share, it's gonna allow you to basically upvote different stuff in here, and they are basically the same thing as said before. So you're gonna be upvoting and doing all that sort of stuff, and we go through the projects of what are the fundamentals for you as you're familiar with regular classic React. What do you need to know in order to move and be able to learn Next.js, and what are the quick stuff that you should actually go ahead and grasp on in order to do that migration. So how Next.js actually works compared to the regular classic Reacts we all know and we all love, and what are the main differences that you should have a bullet point and you should focus on in order to learn and actually get the most out of Next.js in your applications. So in this particular Figma file in here, I got like a pretty simple and super duper simplified architecture of how Next.js actually works compared to the actual React, how it works. So as we all know, maybe you've stumbled upon, maybe you have not, or not yet exactly. So you know this kind of keywords in here, the CSR and the SSR versus SSG. You probably already have heard about this if you went to the, like, for example, the landing page in here. You can like read more about like SSR and SSG and all that sort of stuff. And maybe sometimes it becomes a little bit kind of like, you know, ugly to understand all of those. So try to understand this. If you go to the fundamental and the pretty basic one, which we all know, we all love, which is the regular React from this particular side. So for example, if you take a look on CSR, CSR actually stands for client-side rendering. And what do you mean by client-side rendering? So you can imagine this particular scenario in here. So you got your server, which is, you know, your particular server in here, which hosts your actual application. So you can imagine this server actually hosts a Query React app application, and it hosts the bundled files. So it will be hosting something like the Webpack bundled files, the JavaScript files, the images, and some HTML files you've got. And that's it. And that's basically what React is all about. And mostly it's gonna bundle and it's gonna store the actual JavaScript files, which are super huge. They include something like Webpack, they include something like your application code, and you like your dependencies, polyfills in here exclusive, like it has big dependencies. Okay, so the server has those, and as soon as a user joins and tries to access your web page, tries to request your website, goes to like www.coder1.com, something like this, and it does a request. So it does an initial page request or a single page application request, whatever you want to call it. So the server is going to respond with the JS files. They are still bundled. The server is just going to send you those JS files. It thinks, or basically the service in this particular criteria, it thinks those files are like static files. So it's going to send you the HTML and the JavaScript files, and that is it. And as I said before, they are big bundles. They are a couple hundred kilobytes to more than 1 megabyte. In some cases, yes, because of the dependencies, because everything is, you know, bundled together, like the React dependencies, React DOM, maybe you're using something like Framer Motion, maybe something you're using like Material UI is bundled as well. Anything you're going to be using, any dependency of your application is going to be bundled and put in that bundle. Okay, pretty cool. Now, as soon as the user requests that, it's going to return this bundle into the actual browser. Okay, now the browser, you can't, like, when the browser actually receives the JavaScript and the HTML, it can't just like go ahead and render that. It needs to go interpret, of course, because it uses an interpreter, and it needs to go through that JavaScript file and the JavaScript code and everything to read through and render the actual web page. So it needs a little bit more time to do this. And especially if you got a really huge application, it's going to need a lot more time. So it's going to need to do that. It's going to execute the code. Yes, this is going to take a decent amount of time. And eventually it's going to like, oh, that's it. We render the actual web page and the user can have the first interaction. As you can see, it goes through a lot of stumbles, a lot of like hot points in here in order to actually reach the first interaction of a user, which might cause some delay and a really bad user experience. On the other hand, if we move into SSR and SSG, Both of these are like rendered in the server, but they just differ in a teeny tiny small change. So for example, for SSR, it stands for server-side rendering, and it gets you the rendered data on every single page request. While on SSG, it stands for static side generation, which basically it generates static files or static pages on build time, and only on build time. It's not gonna like regenerate the file every single request or something. Once on build time, you generate something and it's gonna be like there forever, unless you do another build and you update that particular files. Okay, so let's go through what is the architecture behind both of these. So we got the server in here as we did before. It's just a pretty simple server, and this is a Next.js server, okay? It's a Next.js server-side rendering, and this is basically what it's gonna do. So the server in here, when a user comes through and it does an initial page request, for example, it goes to like /upvote or any page we want or any route it goes into. So as soon as he requests that, the server is gonna say, oh, I'm using Next.js, okay? And yes, since I'm using Next.js and for example, I'm using SSR, so on every single page request, I need to go through the files, the bundles, the JavaScript code, my code, everything, and I need to render them on the server. So they're not gonna send the bundles as they are, but it will try to actually render the files on the server. So the user won't know those bundle files, he won't get the bundle files, but he will actually get the actual bundles or the ready-made rendered files. So you can imagine this, we got the big bundle. Now Java or the server side in here in Next.js tries to actually go ahead and interpret that and render it on the server. That's why it's called server-side rendering. So it's gonna do like, oh, it's gonna split them into teeny tiny small JavaScript files, and mostly they're gonna be HTML files because it's gonna render everything to HTML. It's gonna convert React into HTML, which the browser can actually read in a super fast way. So the user can have a really good experience because the interaction now is actually a lot simpler, and the browser doesn't need to go ahead and interpret that and render it, where the user needs to wait a couple of more seconds. Nothing like that. Everything is server-side rendered, and of course you're gonna say, oh, so this depends now on the server. Yes, most of the time the servers are pretty powerful, but this is actually a good sign because if you have a good powerful server, it's gonna serve all of the users that require that. All right, now it's actually the time to go ahead and set up a Next.js application and actually just use some sort of CLI that Next.js provides us with to fundamentally just go ahead and create and scaffold a new project. So if you're familiar with the Create React app or the CLI, well, you can easily go and use Next.js because they basically use the same notion and super simplified. So if you're like the CRI in here, the Create React app, you do npx create react app and you give it your application. You can use TypeScript and so on and so forth. Now for this one, it's a lot simpler to be honest. So you do npx, you do create next up, and you give it the name in here. And of course you can use a couple of options. Maybe you want to use npm, maybe you want to use specific example in here, maybe like you want to do Next.js and sort of stuff. You can easily do that as well. So to initialize this, you can do npx create next up, and you can provide something like -- TypeScript for using TypeScript in these projects, and you can give it a name in here like my Next.js app or something. Once you click enter, everything's going to be installed. It's going to resolve the dependencies, and it's curious in actually installing those particular dependencies. And most of the time, all you're going to need actually this Next.js dependency, which is going to do everything for you behind the scenes, from building to development server and everything you actually need. So if you head over to your projects in here, you're going to find a couple of different stuff compared or versus the regular Create React app projects. So you're going to find something like pages. I created this components folder in here, so it's not a big of a deal. You're going to find something like public, which exists in there as well, which does the same thing, but basically you're going to find styles in here, which are, CSS modules you can go in and export and import. And you're going to find like a next.config.js. If you open up this, you're going to find some simple configuration provided from Next. And this one particularly is going to allow you to configure Next of how Next can interact with React, the rendering part. For example, in this particular case in here, it's enabling the strict mode. So it's going, oh, React strict mode, please go ahead and enable that. And it's going to enable that as well, because we don't have access to the underlying rendering methods of React and everything. Everything is encapsulated, everything is hidden behind the scenes, and it's just going to give us this really awesome configuration to work with, which is so awesome, and it's going to give you a standard platform or standard interface to work across the board. So I absolutely love this. And the last thing in here, if you jump to package.json, you're going to find different scripts. Like for example, the dev in here is going to start a development server, which is so fast, like blazingly fast. You're going to find a build in here, which you're going to build a production one. You're going to find start script and so on and so forth. So let's go ahead and simply just going to start a development server. You're going to do yarn dev, and as soon as that's going to see started server, and it's going to compile it in just a couple of milliseconds. And that's it. So we've got two applications in here, or basically two projects. One using the regular CSR, create React app and everything, so which is pretty simple and everything. And of course, it uses TypeScript. The second one, which we've just set up, is basically the Next.js one. And this particular two projects are completely the same. If we jump into the Google Chrome in here, we're going to find our application. So this is what the application, as you see, one is actually running in port 3001, which is the React application, the CSR one, and the Next.js one, which is running on port 3000. So both of these are identical, as I said before. I've built them the same way, so you can just go in and see what is exactly different on the implementation side. So they're just like an Vote Me application. They allow you to share different comments and everything. So if you head over to, for example, the access in here, you're going to find like an import in here, which is the same thing in here as well. That's going to allow you to add comments. So you can just go ahead and do like, I want to be, I don't know, a hero or something like this. And if you enter in that, it's going to like save this, it's going to add this comment, and you can go in and upvote this, which basically works the same way on both of these, and they share the same API. So I'm using mock API in here to mock everything. So you're going to see me using this API endpoint a lot, and to access, for example, the users, the comments of the users, the about page and everything. So I've tried to put both of the projects side by side in here. From the actual right side, we got the regular React, and from the left side, we got Next.js. So we'll try to go through both of them and their differences. So for example, to start with in here is actually the folder structure or the project structure. On the side in here of the React, it's actually optionated. So you can go through any folder structure you like. For example, what I loved in here, I tried to mimic the same folder structure of Next.js's, but in here you can actually use whatever, because you actually control everything. If you go to the index.typescript in here, you're going to find, oh, you are actually controlling the rendering, how to render it, where to render it, and all that sort of stuff. So everything is controlled by you, and you don't actually need everything from that particular site. Of course, you are also controlling the index.html. You can add whatever you want. You can add head meta masks in here. You can add links, and you can add different stuff like the head, the body, and you can change it however you want. But in the other side in here, if you go to like the folder structure, which that means you can have any folder structure that you would like to, and you can have like components. You can rename this, you can rename the pages in here to something else, and you can point different stuff, and yada yada yada. But on the other hand in here, if you jump onto the Next.js side, you can't have the same, or like you can't have an optionated folder structure of your own. You have to stick what is actually provided for you from the Next.js side, and it's actually a standard folder structure or a standard project structure. So the pages should be included inside of the pages folder. You need to have the components in here are optionated, but you need to still have a same particular structure. For example, if you go to the index in here, or for example, if I try to head over into something like a web page in here, as you see, since we don't have an HTML file, so if I go to the HTML file in here, as you see, we got the HTML file in here, we can have the head and everything. But since on Next.js, you don't have an actual HTML file, everything is handled internally by Next.js. So that means, oh, how am I supposed to access that particular HTML file? Luckily for us, Next.js actually provides those helpful functions or helpful components that allows you to edit that. For example, you can use the head component to actually edit the head in here, and you can change the title of the web page. You can do stuff like that. So of course, there are packages that on React that allows you to do that same thing in here, but this is actually, as I said before, it's optionated on React. You can do whatever you want, but Next.js is more of like a framework, and it's kind of like lock you down on a specific set of standards that you need to use in order to be able to actually use that Next.js properly. The other very crucial part, which is routing. So for example, on the regular React in here, routing needs to be set up by you manually. So what I mean by this, you need to go and install a package like React DOM or something, or React Router DOM, and you need to go like the route, and you can have to specify specific routes in here, and you give them the paths, and you give them different stuff in here. So it's actually optionated again. So React is like an open library, and you can do whatever you want. You can use a different library to do routing and yada yada yada. But when it comes to Next.js, it's actually more of a standardized, and you need to use it in a particular way. So if you head to the pages file or the pages folder I said before, and the pages folder is where your routes are going to exist. So anything you put in here, anything, any name, particularly the name of the folder or the name of the file, is going to make a lot of sense on the route itself. So for example, in here you got the upvote. The name of the folder is actually upvote, so we're going to have a route added for us called /upvote. The same way we do it in here. /upvote is going to be the same thing in here, but we added a folder. You can have an index.js in here to tell it, oh, this is the entry point or the main file for it, or the main component for it, or whatever. You can add different stuff as well, but this is actually going to act the path for this. For example, you have a path for API, you can do that as well. A path for about us page. So /about page is going to be the same, and the index.typescript in here is going to act as a home page. So it's going to be acting as the same thing in here as a / is going to be the same one right over there for the index.typescript. So as you clearly see in here, React and Next.js are different a little bit on the routing side. So you need to go through the documentation of Next.js in order to understand how that routing works. You can do different stuff. You can do dynamic routing like /ID and how to use those particular parameters and yada yada yada, and they are all standardized inside of this particular folder with a particular structure that you need to follow. But of course, on the React side in here, you can follow whatever you want. You can put it inside a pages folder, you can change that folder, and yada yada yada. Now let's see the most crucial part about the difference of Next.js versus regular React application, and what makes Next.js special is the server-side rendering and how it actually works. So let's go and try to see how the application works, particularly this common stuff in here, which, as I said before, you can comment something in here, you can upvote it, and of course it can be sorted out and everything. So you can go in and see how that works. So if you go to the mock API, I can go ahead and refresh that particularly to see how many comments I've got. So I've got only a single comment right now, so I can go and generate dummy comments. I don't care about that. I can go back in here and see how that works. So as soon as I refresh, the comments are going to be fetched from the server on both of these applications, but they're going to be fetched differently. So depending on how the application works, because this uses server-side rendering, so this will be fetched on the server, not on the actual like application in here. But on the other hand, in here for the React application or the browser side in here, it's going to be fetched on the browser, but not on the server, because it doesn't know the server, it doesn't use SSR. Okay, so if I go ahead and like refresh that, I'm gonna see everything in here, and everything's gonna be coming from the server. As clearly see, they are like dummy, and they have been, you know, initialized and everything. As clearly see, sorted out by votes and everything. We're gonna find the same thing in here if I go ahead and refresh. But this one, as clearly see, took a couple of seconds before it fetches, because it actually didn't fetch it on the server, fetch it on the client. So it shows the UI first, then it goes and says, oh, I'm loading something or anything. It does the request to the actual server, and it grabs that particular JSON data. Awesome. And the other side in here, we also got something like, oh, we can add something by ourselves in here. So let me just go ahead and clear out something in here. I can clear it to 4 comments because that looks a little bit too much for me. So if I go back in here, this is another comment or something. I can go in and add this. Of course, this gets added at last in here, and you can do in here, and everything, whenever you click on that, are going to be sent to the server and going to be received and everything. So we got the same behavior in this. So you can go in and add a comment, and it's going to be showing up right over there. All right, so let's go and jump to see how both of these are going to be working on the other side. So if you go to the upvote section, this is actually the upvote file. As you see, we are on it. It's actually the upvote components. So let's go and see first how React does it, which we are all familiar with, of how React fetches stuff and how it uses the use effects and everything. So I actually just go in and do like a fetch comments function in here, or a method that goes ahead and actually uses the fetch method to go to the URL, and it does the fetching of the data, it uses a GET request or whatever, then it does some pre-processing to it to just, you know, change the objects and make sure we get the right user for the particular comment to display that, and yada yada yada. So just doing some pre-processing, and last but not least, we're doing set comment, and we are sending the comment on the state. Nothing different from the actual or what we are usually supposed to do with regular Reacts, of course. So if we jump to the other side, we are doing use effects. So what we mean by use effects is actually whenever the component is mounted and is actually ready to do that, you can go in and fetch the comment, update the state, and of course you can go in and pass those comments in the comment list to render them eventually. That's simply what it is. That's how React works. If you jump into the second side of Next.js of how it works, if you go to, for example, upvotes, as you see, this is what the upvote looks like. It's pretty simple, but the logic and the main part of how Next.js works is actually this particular method or this particular function. It's called the get server side props, and from its name in here you can know, oh, we are using SSR, not SSG, because it's getting server-side props on every single request. So what this one does, it's basically doing the same thing as the fetching in here, but it's actually doing it on the server instead of the component itself or instead of the browser itself. So here on every single request, the server is going to prepare something. It's going to go ahead and do, oh, this particular fetching is going to go to the API, fetch the data, it's going to do the pre-processing for you. It's not going to update the state. Rather, what it does, this gets server-side props. From its name, it's going to get you the props that are going to be passed through to this particular component. As clear as this component actually accepts, or it's actually expecting a data prop in here, and this data prop is going to be passed through from this particular function, that whatever we're actually going to tell it to pass is going to be passed through. So for example, we got props, we're going to have data, and this is what's going to be passed through. So eventually the components, once it's rendered and once you finish the actual server-side rendering for every single request, of course, it's going to have this data with a pre-processed like data in here function. It's going to grab it from the API and everything, and eventually it's going to be passing it through the components. So if you might say, oh, what is the main difference and why you bother doing it this way, why we can do it this way? Of course, the main difference is server-side rendering, and this actually is going to allow you to boost your application performance to 10x compared to the regular React application, because this is going to be rendered and prepared, and the data is going to be fetched by the server. The user won't have to wait much compared to how it does before, because it's going to fetch all the data, and once it does fetch all the data, once it does fetch all the particular data in here, it's going to grab the React application, and it's going to convert this React application alongside the data it fetched from the server into an HTML. So everything is going to be rendered on the server, and only the HTML files are going to be sent down to the browser. And if you're wondering what is the other difference between React and Next.js, so if you jump, for example, to the upvote button in here, which is pretty simple and pretty straightforward. Once you click it, it's going to send a new upvote. It's going to increment that by 1, and it's going to save it on the actual API. So once you click on that, as clear in here, it's going to go ahead and simply just go ahead and update that and actually save it on the API. Both of these in here are going to be working the same way, which, you're going to be changing that, and you're going to have the same behavior of changing the upvote. So let's go ahead and see the underlying behavior on the code. Does it actually matter, or is it difference between React and Next.js? So if you listen here from the actual side of React, of how React actually works, if we jump to that, as clear as we got an upvote function. This is actually the function that is responsible for upvoting. It uses some URL in here, it does puts, it actually puts the body data in here, which is just doing an upvoting, and yada yada yada. And of course, it uses some state to tell you, oh, the number of votes that are currently right now and is upvoting, or set it upvoting, just to know if it's loading or not. Okay, pretty simple and pretty easy straight through. So here, as you see, once we get a new votes, we're gonna just update the state in here to set a new votes, so the actual state can update and we can all see the new changes for that, how it works. Of course, we're just simply passing that to the actual button. So if we go to the button here, we got an on click, and we're passing in upvotes, and that's simply what we're doing in here, and we're passing it loading and everything. It's just regular React. Okay, let's jump to Next.js in here and see how it works. We got the same method. We got the upvote method. We are doing the same thing in here. We're doing or changing the state to know if it's loading or not. We're sending the new data as clears in here, but the only difference is clears in here, we are not actually updating the state after receiving the new stuff. So if we jump back in here, that's what we're doing. We're doing set votes, and we are updating the state. And here, we're not updating the state because we are not caching the state. Rather, what we are doing, we're actually doing it or re-rendering the actual page to get the fresh new data, which is a pretty well made up method that's going to save you tons of state updates, tons of interactions. It's going to save you a lot of time. So the refresh data in here, if we jump to it, it's actually just a function that calls the router.replace, and the router.replace in here, what it does is going to just replace the current URL with the current URL itself. So it's going to refresh the current page, but you're not going to see an actual hard refresh for the browser. It's just going to do an Next.js refresh, which means it's going to do another server-side rendering with the new data. So you're going to do, oh, scroll false, do not scroll to the top of page, whatever. And to see the actual difference between server-side rendering and static-side rendering, for example, you got this about page in here, which is all it is, just like saying about, and it has a couple of text, and of course it uses or basically fetching that particular text from the mock API. So this is not like a complete static thing, it's more of like a dynamic data, but it's actually using static side generation, so it fetches that only once during the build time. Okay, so if we jump back to our more projects in here, we got, for example, the upvote, which uses the get server-side props. And as I said before, this particular function gets called every single time the user requests that particular one. So if the user requests the /upvote 10 times, this particular function is going to fetch the data and it's going to be called 10 times as well. So on every single request, it's going to be called, it's going to be fetching the data, it's going to be passing the new props, and so on and so forth. So that's why server-side rendering is used with dynamic data that needs extra or these like consistent fetching of that particular data from a particular database or API. So on every single request, it gets updated to the new data. If you go to the about page in here, it does the same thing actually. It's actually using API, but instead of get server-side props, it uses get static props. And the get static props on Next.js is responsible for static site generation. So whenever this particular function is actually accompanied with a particular kind of like an about page or any other components, what is going to happen behind the scenes is going to like every single time it's going to do a request, it's going to use the cached one, because this one, it will be called only on build time, not on every single request, only on build time. And what I mean by build time is actually when you take your application and run the yarn build or the next build command, which is going to build you a chunk, which I already did run in here, by the way. So all I did is go ahead and do like yarn build, which did run basically the next build command is in here, and it created the actual bundles. It actually generated the pages, it generated the bundles, it does server side, it did static site generation and all that sort of stuff. And it puts it inside of that particular folder, which is the eventual folder that you're going to need to go ahead and publish into your server for server side rendering. And of course, I just started a simple server that basically go ahead and serves the actual files from the .next in here, which we already built. Okay, so this particular get static props in here only got called once during the build time. So if I go back into this, if you try to see that in action in here, as you can see, if you say, oh, we got server-side renders at runtime, it uses get initial props. So we got one single one and automatically generated as static HTML plus JSON, which uses get static props, which we did in here as well, because that's what we were using. As you can see, it's actually doing this. This is a Lambda. This is just telling you, oh, both of these routes in here, the upvotes are dynamic and they are using server side, but the one with the dot in here, it tells you, oh, this is actually a static page or a static actual route that we did static site generation for it, and we generated the HTML and JSON, we saved it in here, so you don't have to worry about it later on. And if you try to see that in action on /to about, if you go to our server in here, and if you go to the request it does, as you can see, it goes to doing a request to /about, and the actual, what it's actually going to return, it's going to return an index.html. It's not going to return an index.like JavaScript. It's not going to fetch the data anyway, even though we go ahead and change the data on the API. For example, if you can imagine this, if you go to the mock API, go to the about, go to edit, and not actually edit, sorry. If you go to the actual data routes in here and try to change something, for example, I want to completely get rid of this particular paragraph, is like say is deleted or something, and maybe you know, delete both of these or something. I delete two paragraphs, which are those two first paragraphs. So go ahead and update that real quick. We got the about in here to be updated. As you can see, everything is deleted on the database. Now, if I go back, remember, this is not like running the dev server. This is rather running the build production server and like the Next.js production server thing. Okay, so if I go in and refresh that, we should see the new data, right? Not really. We still see the old data because that was built during the build time, and we already did the build, and everything is saved on our folder for the build, and it's not going to do any API requests to see the new data because it uses static site generation. But if this was using actually a server side generation, it would have actually just gone to the server and actually pointed to the API, grabbed the new data or fetched the new data, and actually updated that on every single page request. But rather, it's not doing it on the client, but it's actually more of doing it on the server and actually just handing us the HTML files. So thank you for watching. I really hope you guys enjoyed this particular quick comparison between Next.js and React.js, or the regular React.js, and what are the main differences and what you should keep an eye on when actually trying to migrate or trying to learn Next.js and moving from the regular React application of how it works and everything into Next.js. So thank you guys for watching. Catch you hopefully in the next ones.